The Galactic Council declared war on humanity, then regretted everything. Part 1, The Verdict. The broadcast hit every screen in the galaxy at exactly the same moment. I know because I was watching 3 of them at once, 2 wall panels and my personal reader, when the signal overrode every channel simultaneously and replaced whatever anyone had been watching with the cold, blue seal of the Galactic Council. I had been sitting in the observation lounge of Celestia Prime, the largest diplomatic station in known space, eating something the kitchen staff called a pressed grain cake, which tasted exactly like cardboard soaked in regret. I had been thinking about going to bed early. I had been thinking about a lot of ordinary things. Then the seal appeared, and nothing was ordinary anymore. My name is Yael Doran. I was 34 years old at the time, and I had spent 11 of those years working as Earth's diplomatic attaché on Celestia Prime. My job was to be present, to listen, to represent my species at a station where dozens of alien civilizations conducted their affairs in overlapping layers of ceremony, political strategy, and quiet maneuvering. I was good at my job. I spoke 6 languages besides my own. I had shaken hands, or the equivalent, with ambassadors from species that did not even have hands. I thought I understood how things worked out here, in the deep quiet between stars. The figure that appeared on the screen was Counselor Veth of the Thessari, a being I had spoken with many times over the years. The Thessari were tall, silver-skinned, and formal in the way that old architecture is formal, everything precisely placed, nothing wasted. Veth had always been measured in tone, careful with words. That night, there was something different in their expression. Not anger. Not triumph. Something I could only describe as the look of a person who has already committed to a decision and is now speaking the words out loud for the first time, listening to how they sound, and hoping very hard that they sound right. Veth spoke in the common trade language, which the station's systems rendered in every known tongue simultaneously. The statement was this: the Galactic Council, in a session held that morning with full representation from all 41 member civilizations, had voted to declare a state of open conflict against humanity. The reasons cited were extensive. Humanity was described as chaotic, emotionally unstable, resistant to cooperation, and fundamentally unpredictable in ways that posed a risk to galactic order. Humanity had, in the Council's view, failed every measure of civilized behavior that the rest of the galaxy considered standard. Humanity had been warned, counseled, observed, and assessed over 30 years of contact. The Council had concluded that further integration was not possible. The appropriate response, they had determined, was force. The broadcast lasted approximately 4 minutes. Then the seal disappeared and the screens returned to their normal programming, as though nothing had happened. I sat very still. The pressed grain cake was still in my hand. I set it down on the table. Outside the observation window, the stars hung in their usual arrangement, unimpressed. Let me tell you about the incident that had finally pushed the Council to this decision, because it matters for understanding everything that came after. 8 months earlier, a human cargo pilot named Owen Garrett had been running a routine freight transfer through a system on the outer edge of Council space. Owen was not a soldier. He was 41 years old, had been flying cargo ships since he was 22, and his main interests were old acoustic music and growing tomatoes in the small greenhouse he kept in his ship's back corridor. He was, by any ordinary measure, an unremarkable man doing an unremarkable job. When 3 Varadi warships surrounded his vessel and demanded that he power down and prepare for boarding and seizure, Owen Garrett did not comply. The Varadi were one of the most feared military species in the Council, physically imposing, highly disciplined, and unaccustomed to being refused. They expected Owen to power down. Every species they had ever confronted powered down. Owen did not power down. According to the recovered communications log, he took approximately 12 seconds to assess his situation. Then he got on the open channel, laughed, a genuine, unperformed laugh, the kind that comes from a person who has just realized something that strikes them as both absurd and clarifying, and drove his 30,000-ton mining barge directly into the lead Varadi dreadnought at ramming speed. His ship survived, mostly because it was built to take punishment that would crumple a military vessel. The dreadnought did not survive. The 2 remaining Varadi ships retreated immediately. Owen Garrett limped his damaged freighter to the nearest human outpost, filed a report, and asked if anyone had spare tomato seeds because the impact had destroyed his greenhouse. The Council called it an unprovoked act of aggression. Earth's diplomatic office called it self-defense. The Council called it evidence of species-wide instability. Earth's diplomatic office pointed out, patiently, that a man being surrounded and threatened by 3 warships and responding to protect himself was not instability, it was a very normal reaction. The council responded that no rational species would respond that way. I had spent the 8 months since then trying to bridge that gap in understanding, and I had made no progress, and now I was sitting in an observation lounge watching the stars while the galaxy formally declared war on the 8 billion people I called home. The station's administrator, a polite Keth official named Sorrel, came to find me about 20 minutes after the broadcast ended. Sorrel had 4 eyes and an expression on all of them that I had learned to read as discomfort. Attaché Doran, Sorrel said carefully, the council has requested that all human personnel vacate Celestia Prime within 72 hours. I want you to know that this request was not made by this station's staff. We are simply required to transmit it. I understand, I said. Thank you, Sorrel. Is there anything you need? I thought about that for a moment. Access to the long-range communication array for the next hour. After that, I think I have everything I need. Sorrel gave me access. I spent 45 minutes composing and encrypting a single message to the Earth Defense Command. The message was not long. The most important line was this: they are coming, and they have no idea what that means. Then I packed my bag, said goodbye to Sorrel and the handful of other station staff who came to find me in the corridor, and I went to the departure bay to wait for my transport. The last thing I saw before boarding was a formation of 17 Council warships moving into jump formation on the outer edge of the station's sensor range. They were enormous and beautiful and perfectly arranged, moving in the precise formation that the Council's military doctrine prescribed for overwhelming force deployments. Every line was straight. Every interval was exact. They looked unstoppable. I watched them until my transport's hatch sealed behind me. I felt something that surprised me. Not fear, not for myself, not for home. What I felt was something closer to sorrow. The kind you feel when you can see exactly how something is going to go wrong for someone, and you have no way to stop it, and you are not even certain you should try. Those ships were sailing toward a civilization that had spent 30 years being told it was not welcome at the table, that its way of existing was wrong, that it needed to be quieter and calmer and more predictable. 30 years of patience, of requests made politely and refused politely, of doors that never opened no matter how many times humanity knocked. Now those ships were going to find out what happens when you finally convince a species that knocking will never work. I sat down in my seat, closed my eyes, and hoped that someone on the other end of my message had been listening. Part 2, the first mistake. The Council's fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of our solar system expecting noise. That is the only word for it. They expected noise, emergency broadcasts, civilian panic on open frequencies, frantic attempts at last-minute negotiation, the sounds of a civilization suddenly aware that an overwhelming force had arrived on its doorstep. Every species the Council had ever moved against made noise. It was, apparently, the universal first response to being outgunned and surrounded. You made noise. You reached out. You talked. The Sol system was silent. My name is Priya Okafor, and I am an admiral, though I will be honest with you, I have never loved that word. Admirals in old stories stand on bridges and give speeches and look impressive in the light. I was sitting in a modified rock, specifically a 40-meter asteroid that had been hollowed out over 3 years and fitted with everything a forward command station needs: sensors, communications, enough power to run a small city, and absolutely nothing on the outside that would tell you it was anything other than a piece of ordinary space debris drifting on its usual path through the outer system. We called it the Shelf. There were 46 others like it. I watched the Council fleet arrive on my sensors, and I took a slow breath, and I counted them. 17 ships. Consistent with what Yael Doran's message had told us, which meant the intelligence was good. The lead formation consisted of 3 vessels that my system identified as heavy fleet cruisers, each roughly 6 times the displacement of our largest warship. Behind them, 9 mid-class destroyers, and behind those, 5 support and logistics vessels. Standard overwhelming force configuration, the kind the Council deployed when they wanted a target to look at the numbers and surrender before a single shot was fired. The numbers were, objectively, not good for us. This is the part of the story where a lot of people assume we panicked. We did not panic. Here is what people outside the military tend not to understand about humanity's relationship with being outmatched: we have a great deal of practice. Our history is full of moments where one side had better weapons, more soldiers, higher ground, more resources, and faster ships. History is also full of examples of what happened next, and the results are not always what the side with the advantages expected. We are a species that once decided to cross an ocean on wooden boats without knowing what was on the other side. We are a species that looked at the scale of the universe, registered that we are an almost invisible speck in it, and responded by building telescopes to look farther. Being outmatched is not a condition we find paralyzing. It is, in many ways, a condition we find motivating. We had known this moment was coming for a long time. Not specifically, not with a date marked on a calendar, but the shape of it had been clear for years. 30 years of being told we did not fit, of being assessed and found wanting, of watching the council make decisions that affected human lives without ever asking humans what we thought. 30 years of that tells you something. We had spent a significant portion of that time preparing. The fleet began to move inward. I watched them on the sensor display, 17 bright signatures moving in their precise, doctrine-correct formation toward the inner system. They were heading for Mars, where the largest human population outside Earth lived in a network of pressurized habitats and underground facilities. Taking Mars would give them a bargaining position. That was the logic. They crossed the outer marker at 4 hours after arrival. That was when the mines woke up. I want to be very clear about what the mines were not. They were not weapons. None of them were designed to destroy a ship. What they were designed to do was considerably more irritating. They jammed sensors, interrupted communications, and, most importantly, generated false readings that looked, to anyone trying to navigate by sensor data, like empty space when it was not, and like obstacles when there were none. We had seeded them over 18 months, scattered through the outer system in patterns that appeared completely random but were, in fact, carefully coordinated to funnel anything moving inward toward the Sol system into a set of specific corridors. The Vorati lead cruiser hit the first jamming field at 4 hours and 22 minutes after arrival. I watched their formation begin to fracture on my display. Ships that had been moving with precise confidence began to slow, then to spread, then to lose their intervals as their navigation systems started feeding them contradictory information. The 9 destroyers, which had been operating as a coherent unit, separated into 3 smaller groups over the course of the next 2 hours as each group's sensors painted a slightly different picture of the space around them. The support vessels stopped moving entirely and held position while their crews tried to figure out what was happening. We did not fire a single weapon. Not in the first 6 hours. Not in the second 6 hours. We herded them. My communications officer, a quiet and meticulous young man named Patrick Ellsworth, had been monitoring the council's internal frequencies since the moment they arrived. The signals were encrypted, but the encryption was not as advanced as ours. One of the small advantages of 30 years of being excluded from council technology sharing agreements is that you develop your own, and sometimes your own turns out to be better. Patrick had been working on their cipher protocols for 2 years. He passed me a translation headset and let me listen. The confusion was remarkable. Not because the council officers sounded incompetent, they did not, they sounded well trained and disciplined, but because the texture of their confusion was so specific. They could not understand where the interference was coming from. They could see no ships on their sensors, no installations, nothing that should be producing jamming at this scale. Their doctrine had no protocol for an enemy that was apparently invisible and apparently unwilling to engage. They kept preparing for a confrontation that did not come. I heard one exchange between the captain of the lead cruiser and whoever was on the other end of their command channel that has stayed with me ever since. The captain said, in translation, "There is nothing here. There is nothing here and yet we cannot move correctly. Where are they?" And the voice on the other end said, "Our models projected immediate contact. They should be broadcasting. Why are they not broadcasting? Because we had nothing to say yet. Because the conversation had not reached the point where our words would matter." At hour 14, the lead cruiser's captain got on an open frequency, not the command channel, the open one, the one they knew we could hear, and broadcast a formal demand for humanity to identify its military assets, stand down all interference, and prepare representatives for immediate negotiation. Patrick looked at me across the sensor room. His expression asked the obvious question. "Not yet," I said. "Let them get a little more lost first." He nodded and went back to his station. The hours continued. The fleet continued to fragment and drift in the outer system. They began using shorter-range navigation that did not rely on sensors, essentially flying blind at reduced speed and using visual confirmation to move. It was careful and methodical, and I respected the discipline it took, but it was also extremely slow. At that pace, they would reach Mars in approximately 3 weeks. We had prepared for that possibility too. At hour 19, one of the destroyer groups found the first of our relay stations. It was an older model, deliberately left without any active concealment, positioned exactly where a searching sensor sweep would find it eventually. It looked like a standard deep space communications repeater. It was broadcasting a looping signal on a frequency the Council would recognize as a civilian emergency band. The destroyer group stopped and scanned it extensively. Then they reported to the command channel that they had found a human installation. The command channel responded with what sounded like relief. What the relay station was actually doing, besides looking like an ordinary communications relay, was measuring the exact sensor frequency and resolution of every scan the destroyers ran on it. That information went immediately to Patrick's station. Got their active sensor profile, Patrick said quietly. Good, I said. Update the mines. The update pushed out to the entire mine network over the next 40 minutes. Every jamming field in the outer system recalibrated to match the exact sensor frequencies the destroyer group had just revealed, which made them approximately 3 times more effective. The destroyers, satisfied they had found something, moved on. The fleet spent another full day in the outer system in various states of navigational frustration before the command channel broadcast something new. Not a demand this time. A question. They asked, on the open frequency, what humanity wanted in order to stand down. I thought about that for a while. Then I picked up the transmitter. This is Admiral Priya Okafor of the Earth Defense Command. We want a seat at the table. We have always wanted a seat at the table. We have been asking for one for 30 years. We are still asking. The difference now is that we are asking from a position where you cannot simply ignore us. When you are ready to have that conversation, we are ready to have it. Until then, please be patient. We have plenty of time. I put the transmitter down. Patrick was looking at me with an expression I could not quite read. Do you think that will work? He asked. Not immediately, I said. But they needed to hear it. And we needed to say it. The record matters. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Admiral, their lead cruiser has adjusted course. They are moving toward the inner marker. I see it. I watched the display. The lead cruiser was moving with purpose now, not searching. They had decided on a direction. Patrick, activate the secondary corridor channels. Activating. The outer system rearranged itself around them invisibly, quietly, the way a river rearranges water around a stone. They moved through it thinking they had found a path. They had found the path we wanted them to find. 3 weeks, I had estimated. We could afford 3 weeks. Every day the fleet spent in the outer system confused and separated was a day the inner system grew more prepared, more organized, and more certain of its next move. I refilled my coffee, which had gone cold while I was watching sensors, and I thought about Owen Garrett and his greenhouse and his tomatoes, and I thought about the 30 years of closed doors, and I thought about 17 ships sailing into a system that had spent all of that time getting ready for exactly this. They had declared war on us because they thought we were unpredictable. They had no idea how much planning unpredictable people can do. Part 3, What We Are. The first prisoner I interviewed was a Varadi general, and he was sitting on a folding chair looking at his own hands. His name, as best as our translation systems could render it, was something like Commander Ashvorth. The Varadi naming convention involves tonal components that do not transfer cleanly to human phonetics, so we shortened it. He was tall, even seated, with 4 arms folded in what his species' body language apparently indicated was a state of deep discomfort. He had been captured during a brief engagement at the outer edge of the asteroid belt, when the separated destroyer group he was commanding ran into a set of obstacles our ships had arranged with some care. No one had been seriously hurt on either side. He had been treated well, given food that our xenobiological team confirmed was safe for Varadi physiology, and placed in a clean room with a working environmental system. When I walked in, he looked up, and there was something in his expression that I had not expected. He was not angry. He was not defiant. He was frightened, not of me specifically, but of something he was trying to process, some understanding that was forming in his mind that he clearly did not know what to do with. My name is Soren Mack. I trained as a xenobiologist, spent 8 years studying comparative psychology across species, and somewhere in between I became the person the military called when they needed someone to sit down with beings from other civilizations and figure out what was actually going on inside their heads. It is not a glamorous job. It involves a great deal of sitting in plain rooms and listening carefully. I sat down across from Ashvorth and activated my translation unit. "How are you feeling?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have been in military service for 22 years. I have never been captured before. Has any Varadi commander been captured in combat before? He thought about it. In recent history, in the history I was trained in, no. Wars do not typically reach this stage. What stage? The stage where one side captures the other, he said. Wars end before that. There are terms. There are negotiations. One side recognizes the situation and accepts the outcome. I nodded. And what do you think happened this time? He looked at his hands again. Your species did not recognize the situation. Or, I said carefully, we recognized it differently than you expected. He considered that. The Varadi have a particular stillness when they are thinking hard, they go very quiet, and their secondary arms fold closer to the body. He was very still now. Your people have been in conflict before, he said. It was not quite a question. Extensively, I said. With each other. Mostly with each other, yes. Also with environments. With disease. With circumstances. Humanity has a long history of being in conflict with things that seemed overwhelming. And the outcomes? Mixed, I said honestly. We lose sometimes. We have lost badly, historically. But we have a particular tendency to continue. Long past the point where, from the outside, it would seem rational to stop. He was quiet again. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. The Council's models assigned a very short conflict duration. 11 days to full capitulation. The model was based on every prior conflict we have observed or participated in. What was the model missing? He looked at me directly. His eyes, the Varadi have three, arranged in a slight arc, were focused and serious. Your history, he said. We studied your technology. We studied your political structure. We studied your diplomatic communications. We did not study your history. What would you have found? He unfolded one of his upper arms and placed the hand flat on the table between us, a gesture that his species apparently uses when making a significant statement of acknowledgement. We would have found, he said slowly, that your species has been in severe conflict, against opponents with more resources, better equipment, and superior numbers, on many occasions. And that the outcomes were not always what the superior side predicted. That is accurate. We also would have found, he continued, that your species has a relationship with continuation that is, unlike anything we have encountered. Other species, when a conflict becomes costly enough, reach a point of reorientation. They recognize the cost exceeds the benefit. They adjust. Your species, he paused. Your species appears to interpret cost differently. As though cost itself becomes a reason to continue rather than a reason to stop. I thought about how to explain this. There is a long answer and a short answer, and neither one fully captures it, but I tried. We have a concept, I said, called sunk cost. We are aware of it. We teach it in schools. We know, intellectually, that the amount already invested in something should not determine whether you continue. And yet. I spread my hands. And yet we also have something else. We have a belief, not universal, not without exceptions, but deeply embedded in many of our cultures, that the things worth having are the things that are hard to get. That difficulty is not evidence that you are on the wrong path. Sometimes difficulty is evidence that the path matters. He was watching me carefully. Let me tell you something that might help, I said. We have a religious tradition, one of several, but one that has had significant influence on human culture across centuries. At the center of that tradition is a figure who was put to death. And 3 days later, according to the tradition, that figure simply decided not to stay dead. Ashvaratha's three eyes all moved slightly in a way that I had learned to read as surprise. That is, he stopped. That story has been told and retold in our culture for 2,000 years, I said. Whatever you think about the historical or theological claims, what it tells you about the people who kept telling it is something important. We find that story meaningful. We find it resonant. We return to it. What does that tell you about how we think about what happens when something ends? He did not answer immediately. He sat with it for a while. Then he said, I need to speak with the council. I will pass that request along, I said. I cannot promise anything. I understand. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Dr. Mack. When you came in, you asked how I was feeling. That is an unusual opening. It is how we usually start conversations, I said. Even with enemies. We try not to think of you as enemies, I said. You are the Council's military. The Council made a decision. You followed orders. That is different from being our enemy as a species. He looked at me for a long time. Your species is very strange, he said finally. We know, I said. We have been told. I conducted 41 interviews over the following weeks, with captured soldiers and officers from 6 different species. Every conversation was different in its specifics and remarkably similar in its shape. They had all expected a short conflict. They had all expected noise and fear and quick negotiation. None of them had expected silence and patience and the particular, unsettling competence of a species that had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. A young Keth soldier named something I transliterated as Vel told me, in our third conversation, that what frightened her most was not anything we had done. It was something she had noticed about our soldiers, the ones who had been at the outer marker engagement when her unit was captured. They were calm, she said. Not the calm of people who are not afraid. The calm of people who are afraid and have decided to be calm anyway. That is different. That is harder. We do not train for that. Why not? I asked. Because we do not have to, she said simply. Our conflicts do not last long enough. Fear becomes irrelevant quickly because the conflict ends. Yours, she paused. How long have you been afraid? I thought about 30 years of closed doors. About Owen Garrett and his mining barge and his tomatoes. About 17 warships sailing toward a home that had spent all of those years quietly getting ready. A while, I said. She nodded slowly. That is what I thought. Ashvaratha's request to contact the Council was eventually passed up the chain. I do not know exactly what happened at that level. What I know is that by the time the request reached whoever needed to approve it, the situation in the outer system had developed significantly, and the conversation shifted from whether to negotiate to when. Ashvarath, sitting in his clean room with his folding chair and his thoughts, had concluded something that his commanding officers in the field were still working toward. He was not afraid of losing the war anymore. He was afraid of what winning would cost the Council, and he had begun to suspect that no one in the Council chamber had done the calculation properly before the vote was cast. I think he was right. I think if they had read the history, not the technology assessments, not the diplomatic records, but the actual history, the long strange story of a species that crossed oceans on wooden boats and looked at an incomprehensible universe and responded by building better telescopes, I think the vote might have gone differently. But they had not read the history. And now they were living inside it. Part 4, The Hard Lesson. The corridors of Europa Station were cold even on a good day. On the day the Keth landing units came through the North Lock, the temperature in Corridor 7 had dropped to 4 degrees because someone had cut the heating relay on purpose, that someone being me, 40 minutes before the first sensor alert, when I was still 3 turns away and moving fast in the dark. My name is Van Vasquez, and I had been stationed at Europa for 14 months. I was 26 years old, infantry, and I want to be honest with you about something before I continue. I am not a hero. I am a person who trained hard for a thing that I hoped would never happen and then had to do the thing anyway. The distinction matters to me. Europa Station was a scientific and resource facility built into the moon's ice shelf over the course of 20 years. It had about 4,000 people in it on the day the Council fleet's ground units arrived, and roughly 800 of those people were military. The rest were engineers, researchers, and support staff who had been evacuated to the lower levels when the alert came in. The Council's logic was sound, as far as it went. Taking a station with people in it, particularly a station with a civilian population, was a way to force negotiation without a conventional military engagement. No reasonable opponent would allow civilians to remain in a contested position. You take the station, you hold the civilians as a bargaining point, you get the negotiation you want. The assumption buried in that logic was that we would let them take the station. Lieutenant Kara Sutton, my commanding officer, the person I would follow into any situation without hesitation, had been planning the defense of Europa Station for 11 months. Not defensively, the way you plan to hold a wall. Offensively, the way you plan to make the other side wish they had chosen a different wall. Kara had walked every corridor of that station so many times that she knew which panels rattled slightly when the pressure fluctuated, which junction boxes could be used as cover and which ones could not, which maintenance tunnels connected to which sections and how long it took to get from any point to any other point in the dark without a light. She had shared that knowledge with all of us. And then she had done something else. She had, over 11 months, made very small, very deliberate changes to the station's infrastructure. Not enough to be obvious in any single inspection. Not enough to trigger maintenance alerts. But enough that, when the moment came, the station itself would become a tool. The Keth landing units came through the North Lock in good formation. There were approximately 300 of them, organized into groups of 15, moving with discipline and care in the unfamiliar environment. Their equipment was excellent. Their coordination was good. They had trained for enclosed environment operations and it showed. What they had not trained for was an environment that actively disagreed with them. The heating cut was first. Cold slows you down in ways that are subtle and cumulative, your hands are less precise, your reaction time extends by small fractions, your attention narrows because part of your mind is managing physical discomfort. 4 degrees is not dangerous. It is just uncomfortable enough to cost you something. Then the lights in Corridor 7 went out. Not all the lights, just Corridor 7, which happened to be the main arterial route between the North Lock and the central hub. The Keth units had lighting equipment and they deployed it efficiently. But handheld lights in a long corridor cast specific shadows, and those shadows go in predictable directions, and if you know where the shadows will fall, you know where to not be. We knew where to not be. I want to avoid making this sound simple, because it was not simple. It was exhausting and frightening, and there were moments where I was very aware that the situation could go wrong in ways I did not want to think about. But I also want to be honest that the engagement in Corridor 7 and the adjacent sections lasted 6 hours, and at no point did the Keth units gain the access they needed to reach the central hub, despite outnumbering our combat personnel significantly. We moved through the station the way water moves, not forcing, not pushing, finding the available spaces and using them. I spent 40 minutes in a maintenance shaft above Junction 3, completely still, watching through a sensor feed on a device the size of my thumb, waiting. The Keth patrol passed below me 4 times. On the 5th pass, the moment was right, and I moved. I will not describe every moment. What I will tell you is that we held, and that the way we held was not by being stronger or better equipped. It was by knowing our ground in a way the Keth units could not match, and by being willing to be patient in situations where patience was very difficult. At the 4-hour mark, a Keth commander got on an open channel and said that our methods were, in his translation, dishonorable and contrary to accepted rules of engagement. Kara Sutton keyed up. Her voice was completely level. "Sir," she said, "we did not start this war." Then she activated the charge she had wired under the bridge at Junction 8 17 days before the Keth fleet ever reached the outer system. She had done it on her own time, during what was officially listed as a maintenance inspection, and she had told no one except me and 2 others. The bridge had been structurally sound right up until the moment it was not. The junction cut off the forward element of the Keth advance from their support element. The 2 groups spent the next 40 minutes trying to find each other through corridors that Kara had spent 11 months learning to use as walls. At hour 5, I came around a corner in a section that my sensor feed showed as clear, and I found that it was not entirely clear. There was a Keth soldier sitting against the wall of the corridor, young, from what I could assess, in the way that youth looks the same across species, something not yet settled in the face, something still forming. He was not in a fighting stance. His equipment was lowered. He looked up when I came around the corner, and neither of us moved for a moment that felt much longer than it was. I assessed him. He assessed me. Neither of us had a clear advantage and neither of us acted. I made a decision. I am not entirely sure why I made it, instinct, training, something less definable. I sat down against the opposite wall, 3 meters away from him, and I put my equipment down in a position that was clearly not aggressive. He watched me. I reached into my kit and pulled out a water container and held it out toward him. Universal gesture, I hoped. He looked at it for a moment, then crossed the corridor and took it and sat back down against his wall. We did not share a language. Not a single word. His translation unit and mine were different enough that neither produced comprehensible output when we tried. So we sat there in a cold corridor with the distant sounds of the engagement around us, and I pulled out the small case I keep in my front pocket, the one with the photo of my dog, an enormous, ridiculous animal named Cap who takes up 2/3 of any piece of furniture he occupies, and I held it out. The Keth soldier looked at it for a long time. Then he reached into his own equipment and produced something that he held carefully, a flat, pressed shape that might have been a plant at some point, preserved between 2 thin plates of something transparent. He held it so I could see. I did not know what it meant to him. I could not ask. But the fact of it was clear, that he carried it, that he had kept it through whatever had brought him here, that it mattered to him. We sat there for perhaps 8 minutes. Then my comm unit activated with Kara's voice telling me to return to position, and I stood up, and I gathered my equipment. I looked at the Keth soldier. He looked at me. I pointed down the corridor in the direction away from the central hub, away from where his units needed to go. He understood what I was telling him. He looked at me for another moment, then he stood, and he went in the direction I had pointed. I turned and went back to my position. I thought about him for a long time afterward. I thought about the pressed plant and what it meant that he had brought it with him across light years of space to a moon of a planet he had probably never heard of 6 months ago, and I thought about how small the distance between us had felt in that corridor, and I thought about how strange it is that the same species which produces war also produces the particular human reflex of handing water to someone who needs it, even when that someone is, in some technical sense, on the other side of something. At hour 6, the Keth commander broadcast a withdrawal request and asked for safe passage out of the station for his units. Kara confirmed the request with our command authority and granted it. The Keth units moved back to the North Lock in good order and departed. Europa Station held. It was the first time in recorded galactic history that a Council ground incursion had been fully repelled. The record showed it happening. Whether the Council was ready to understand what the record meant was a different question entirely. But the record was there, written in cold corridors and cut heating relays, and the small fact of a young soldier walking away in the direction a stranger had pointed. Part 5, After Everything. The conference room on Celestia Prime had not changed. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked back in. The same long table of pale material that the Thessari use for formal settings, curved slightly at the ends. The same lighting, soft and directionless, designed to be comfortable for 12 different kinds of eyes. The same high windows looking out onto the docking approaches where ships came and went in their usual steady rhythm. I had sat in this room dozens of times over my 11 years on the station, and it looked exactly the same, and I was aware that I looked considerably different. My name is Yael Doran. I was 34 when the war started. I was 35 when I walked back into that room to end it. The Council had requested ceasefire talks. The request had been formal and precisely worded and had arrived through official channels with all the appropriate courtesies attached. Our government had considered it for 4 days and then accepted, and I had been selected to go because I was there at the beginning, and that kind of continuity matters in diplomacy. You start with the same face and you end with the same face. It tells the other party that the person across the table has been living inside this the whole time, that they know it from the inside, that they are not reading from a briefing document. I knew it from the inside. I walked into the room and the Council representatives were already seated, 12 of them, from 11 different species, because the Thessari held 2 seats in this format. I recognized all of them. Councillor Veth was directly across from the chair that was clearly meant for me, and when I sat down, they held my gaze in a way that contained something I had never seen in their face before. It was not guilt exactly, and it was not fear. It was the particular expression of someone who has recently learned a thing that they cannot unlearn. I had seen that expression before. I had seen it on Ashvaratha's face in a small room, and on the faces of other soldiers in other small rooms, and now I was seeing it at the Council table itself, at the level where the decision had been made. Attaché Doran, Councillor Veth said. Thank you for coming. Of course, I said. There was a brief formal period, as there always is in Council settings, an acknowledgement of the parties present, a confirmation of the meeting's purpose, a statement from the lead Council member. Veth handled this with their usual precision. The words were correct and measured and appropriately somber. Then, when the formalities were done, Veth looked at me and said something that was not on any official agenda. Our internal models, they said, projected 11 days to complete human capitulation. I know, I said. We were told. We are at 387 days. I know that too. Veth was quiet for a moment. The other representatives were watching me with varying expressions. The Keth delegate, not Vel, the soldier I had heard about from Soren's reports, but a senior diplomat named Orith, had both sets of hands folded on the table and was watching me with an attention that felt like being measured. We made, Veth said carefully, a significant error. Several, I said, and then, because the moment was important and I did not want it to become adversarial, we understand why. We understand that your assessment was based on prior conflicts and prior behavior. We are not a prior conflict. We are not prior behavior. That is genuinely difficult to model. We did not read your history, Veth said. No. We read your technology assessments. We read your diplomatic records. We observed your public communications and your scientific publications. We built a picture of your species that was, they paused, technically accurate in every specific detail and fundamentally wrong in its overall shape. That happens, I said, when you study what a species does without studying what a species is. The room was very quiet. What are you? Asked the Keth delegate, Orith, and the question was direct enough that several of the other representatives shifted slightly in their seats. I had thought about how to answer that question. Soren had sent me a summary of his interview work, and I had read all 41 conversations carefully on the transport flight out, and I had thought about what the through line was, what the thing was that every interviewee had bumped into and been unable to name. We are a species, I said, that developed on a planet that was trying to remove us for most of our evolutionary history. Disease, weather, other predators, the planet's own systems. Everything was larger or faster or more numerous than us. We did not have armor or venom or great physical strength. What we had was the ability to learn, remember, and cooperate. And a specific refusal to stop. Refusal, said the Thessari second seat, a counselor named Ral who had always struck me as sharper than their senior colleague. When a human faces a situation that is going badly, I said, there is a decision point. Any thinking being reaches that point. The question is what they do there. Many species, many very intelligent, capable species, reach that point and recalibrate. They assess the cost and conclude the direction is wrong and they change direction. That is rational. That is sensible. That is, in most contexts, wise. I paused. We do not always do that. Not because we are irrational, but because we developed in an environment where the cost of stopping was the end of everything. You do not stop in a landscape that is actively trying to end you. You find another way. You adapt. You continue. And that tendency, which developed over millions of years in a very specific and very difficult environment, does not simply turn off when the environment changes. It is part of what we are. Orith said, you are describing stubbornness. In part, I said. I am also describing creativity. And endurance. And a very particular way of looking at setbacks that does not register them as signals to stop but as problems to be solved. Those things are connected. You do not get one without the others. Veth was watching me. The soldier at Europa Station, they said. The one who extended water to the Keth unit member in corridor. That is also us, I said. Both things are us. The strategic preparation and the water in the corridor. We contain both of those things simultaneously and we do not find that contradictory. The room was quiet again for a longer moment. Then Veth said, what are your terms? I had prepared for this. Our government had prepared for this. There had been long discussions about what to ask for and how to ask for it, and I had been part of those discussions, and I want to be honest that they were difficult discussions, because there was a range of opinion among humans about what this moment deserved. Some people wanted significant concessions. Some people wanted formal acknowledgement of specific grievances. Some people wanted things that I understood emotionally and could not support diplomatically. What I had been authorized to present was built on a principle that our lead negotiating team had established early and held to firmly. We were not interested in punishing the council. We were not interested in making them feel what we had felt for 30 years, though I understood why some people wanted that. What we were interested in was a structure that made the next 30 years different from the last 30. 3 things, I said. A permanent human seat on the Galactic Council, with full voting rights and equal standing to all other member civilizations. Not an observer position, not a consultative role. A seat. Veth nodded slowly. Formal recognition of human sovereignty over Earth, its moon, Mars, and the outer system installations we have developed. No council jurisdiction within those boundaries without explicit human consent. Another nod. A joint commission, human and council, to review the contact protocols that failed over the last 30 years, identify what went wrong, and develop a new framework that can apply to any emerging civilization the council encounters in the future. So that this does not happen again. Not with us. Not with anyone. The third one was the one I thought would be hardest. Giving us a seat was expensive politically but not philosophically difficult. Recognizing our sovereignty was a matter of accepting a reality that already existed. But committing to a review of the council's own procedures, acknowledging that the procedures were wrong, agreeing to build something better, that required a kind of institutional honesty that governing bodies across any civilization find uncomfortable. Veth was quiet for a long time. Then they said, the third item is not a demand. No, I said. It is a request. The first two are demands, if we must use that word. The third is a request from a species that spent 30 years being told it was not ready for the room, to the species that told us that, asking them to help us make sure nobody else gets told the same thing for the same wrong reasons. Counselor Rao made a sound that the translation unit rendered as an acknowledgement. Several of the other representatives were exchanging looks with each other. I could not read all of them, but some I could. Orith, the Keth delegate, said, "You could have asked for more." "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you?" I thought about that for a moment. Because we are not in this room to collect what we are owed. We are in this room to get what we need. Those are different amounts. You believe the council would have given more? Orith pressed. I believe the council would have negotiated anything at this point, I said honestly. That is not the right basis for a relationship. We want a relationship, not a settlement. If we take everything we could possibly take right now, we are a species that took advantage of a moment of weakness. If we take what we need to participate fully and equally, we are a species that wants to be part of this. I let that sit for a moment. We have always wanted to be part of this. That is the thing the council missed in its assessments. We were not waiting outside the door because we wanted to knock it down. We were waiting because we wanted someone to open it. The session continued for another 4 hours. There were detailed discussions about the structure of the Human Council seat, about the specific boundaries of the sovereignty recognition, about the composition and mandate of the Joint Commission. Our legal team was connected by relay and participated in the technical portions. The Council's legal advisors were thorough and occasionally difficult and ultimately cooperative in a way that I had not expected and was grateful for. At the end of the session, the terms were agreed in principle. The formal treaty document would take 3 more weeks to finalize. There would be 2 more sessions before the signing. When the meeting formally closed, Veth asked the other representatives to give us a moment. They filed out with the quiet efficiency that council diplomats learn early, and Veth and I sat across the table from each other in the empty room. "I owe you an apology," Veth said. "I do not need one," I said. "You may not need it, but I would like to offer it." They held my gaze. I argued against the war in the session. I was in the minority. I believed the diplomatic approach had not been given sufficient time. I was overruled. I thought about that. I didn't know. "It is not a public record," Veth said. "I am telling you now because I think you should know that there were voices on this side of the table that disagreed. Not enough voices. But they existed. What made the majority go the other way?" Veth considered this carefully. "Fear," they said at last. "Not of what humanity was. Fear of what humanity might become if it were integrated into galactic society at full standing. A species that does not behave predictably. A species whose emotional intensity is, by our standards, extreme. A species whose history includes patterns that we found very difficult to understand and that we found, honestly, frightening." "We frighten you," I said. "You are very alive," Veth said. "In a way that most council species are, and I want to be precise here, not. We are old, many of us. The Thessari have been spacefaring for 12,000 years. We have settled into our forms. Our politics, our culture, our way of engaging with the universe, they are stable. Refined. Consistent. When we encountered humanity, we encountered something that reminded us of what we might have looked like at the very beginning, and we were not certain we found that comforting. And now?" I asked. Veth looked at me for a long moment. "Now I think we were afraid of the wrong thing. We were afraid of the instability. We were not afraid, as we should have been, of what happens when you spend 30 years refusing to engage with a species like yours and then expect that refusal to have no consequences. You expected us to wait indefinitely," I said. "We expected you to accept the situation," Veth said. "Most species do." "We waited 30 years," I said. "That is a long time for us. Our average lifespan is about 80 years. 30 years of waiting is a significant portion of a human life." The people who were young adults at first contact were approaching old age by the time the war started. An entire generation lived their whole active lives being told the door was closed. Veth was quiet. "We are patient," I said. "More patient than you seem to have expected, given everything. But we are not infinitely patient. And I think if I could change one thing about how the last 30 years went, it would not be anything on our side of the table. It would be that moment, somewhere in those early years, when someone in the council should have looked at the file on humanity and said, these people are going to run out of patience eventually, and we should figure out what we want to have offered them before that happens. Yes, Veth said. That is what should have happened. We sat there for a while in the quiet room. Outside the window, a ship was moving away from the docking arms, catching the distant light of the sun in a way that made it briefly bright against the dark. I will see you at the second session, Veth said finally. I will be there, I said. I left the room and walked through the station's corridors toward the departure bay. Some of the faces I passed belonged to people I recognized from before, station staff, diplomats from other civilizations, a few researchers who live permanently on Celestia Prime and had been here through the entire conflict. Some of them looked at me with expressions I could not read. Some of them nodded. My transport was waiting. My communications officer, not Patrick Ellsworth this time, but a young ensign named Lena Crown who had been assigned to my diplomatic detail 3 months ago, was checking the departure clearances at the bay entrance. She looked up when she heard me coming. How did it go? She asked. Well, I said. It went well. She fell into step beside me as we walked toward the transport hatch. We passed the window I had stood at, over a year ago now, watching 17 warships form up for a jump that I had known would go badly for them. How do you feel? Lena asked. I thought about that for a while. I thought about Owen Garrett and his tomatoes and the mining barge and the laugh on the open frequency. I thought about Priya Okafor in her hollow rock watching a fleet run into invisible walls. I thought about Soren sitting across from Ashforth and asking how he was feeling. I thought about Fan Vasquez in a cold corridor handing water to a stranger who carried a pressed flower across the stars. I thought about 30 years of doors that did not open and all the people who knocked on them anyway, quietly and persistently, right up until the moment they decided to knock differently. Tired, I said. And a little proud. And ready to go home. The hatch sealed behind us. The transport pushed back from the bay, and Celestia Prime fell away behind us, and the stars arranged themselves in their usual patterns in the windows, vast and permanent and completely unimpressed by anything that happened in the narrow space between them. Somewhere out there, I knew, 37 species were having quiet conversations about what had just happened and what it meant for the future. Some of those conversations were, I suspected, quite worried in tone. Good. Worried people pay attention. Worried people think carefully before acting. Worried people do not send 17 warships toward a species they have not properly studied and expect easy results. We had spent 30 years asking for a seat at the table. We had it now. We had not gotten it the way we wanted. We had gotten it the way it turned out to be available. And we would sit in it, and we would participate, and we would be difficult sometimes and surprising often and occasionally baffling in ways that would make the older civilizations shake their heads. And we would be there. Fully, loudly, completely there. That was all we had ever wanted. The transport accelerated into the dark and carried me home.